Okay, I think we are good to go. Yeah, we're recording. So, evening everyone. Thanks for dialing on today. So I guess me and Bex, who are leading this session today, are going to cover how you can use your menstrual cycle to kind of optimize training or performance. We are aware there's lots of different circumstances, and we've already had some questions that are quite specific. We'll do our best to answer as much as we can through today's session. Obviously, we don't want it to be running into everyone's evenings too much. But yeah, we'll do questions at the end. So if you have text, or I've had a couple of WhatsApps today, or if you do want to WhatsApp or email me, I've put my email in the chat. You can kind of ask and we can go through those at the end. So before we kind of kick off with today's session, I thought the best thing to do is to introduce myself, and then for Bex to also introduce herself for those that may not be familiar with us and why we're talking about this topic today. So Bex, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, so I'm Bex Holland. I'm one of the TCT coaches. I've been coaching for 3 or 4 years, been a triathlete and cyclist for more years than I care to remember, 15 plus. And my background is actually sport and exercise science, specialising in women in sport. When I did my degree, I just put that down for a bit and went to work in a different field for a few years. So now trying to come back to my roots.
Fab. And then for those that don't know me, I'm Dr. Kelsey Johnson, part of Total Endurance Nutrition. So I currently work as a lecturer in sports nutrition and physiology at Liverpool John Moores University, heavily interested in the female athlete, and also conduct a lot of research in the area alongside some of the other nutritionists within the team, so particularly Jules and also Harvey as well, who I know is also on the call today. So between us all, I think there's hopefully a lot of knowledge that we'll be able to kind of impart on you today. So the first thing we're going to cover is, oh, let me make sure I've got my slides up so I can hit next. Oh, this all works fun and games. There we go. So the first thing we wanted to really cover is just to go over like the basics of what actually is the menstrual cycle and kind of what it means and what it looks like. So I tried to make it not too sciencey or like research driven, but I wanted to kind of give you a bit of a figurative overview of what the menstrual cycle actually looks like. So you might see people describe it slightly differently in terms of the specific phases, but kind of for the interest of keeping it as simple and for what you guys probably need to know from a training and performance perspective, we're going to split the menstrual cycle into 2 specific phases. We have what we call the follicular phase, which the first day of the follicular phase is known as day 1 of your menstrual cycle. The first half or the first few days, depending on how long your period lasts, is where your menses or your period actually falls. And then you also have the luteal phase, which is the second half of your menstrual cycle. And the 2 things that I guess divide or define these 2 phases is something that we call ovulation, which I'll talk about in a second. So throughout a typical cycle, so in this example that we've got in front of us, it is a 28-day cycle, and we'll talk about how that can vary between individuals, but then also between cycles as well as we go on throughout today. But this is an example of a 28-day cycle. Typically, a female will ovulate, or the midpoint of their cycle happens during day 14, so the midpoint of their cycle, whatever number that may be. And the thing that regulates this is the interaction between your female specific sex hormones, so estrogen and progesterone, which are involved in kind of regulating this cycle. But then we also have 2 other things that are kind of abbreviated on the screen. One's LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. This is responsible for the stimulation of ovulation. And then we also have follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the growth of a follicle inside an ovary. And that follicle is what contains an egg. So what happens is we go through the first half of the cycle, we get this surge in LH, we have an egg that's released from the ovary and travels down the fallopian tube. And if it meets a sperm, that's where like fertilization can occur. So remember, the whole point of our kind of menstrual cycle is to reproduce. That's why we have it. If the egg doesn't meet a sperm and isn't fertilized, after about 24 hours, it disintegrates. That sends a signal to the body, okay, fertilization hasn't occurred, we don't need to prepare for a baby, and the cycle starts all over again. So that's kind of a brief overview of the menstrual cycle in short. Bex, do you think I've missed anything there?
No, I think the important point is that, you know, the reason we have it is to reproduce. Whether we choose to or not is a different matter. In real simple terms, I always say, you know, you feel pretty good at the beginning of your cycle because your body's realised it's not pregnant and can do other stuff. So, you know, you tend to feel pretty good. The second half of your cycle, your body thinks it might need to start making a baby. So, you know, starts to do other stuff and you can feel some side effects, which we'll go into. But that, like, if you want to really oversimplify it, that is the best way to remember it. First half, oh, I'm not having a baby, so I tend to feel pretty good. Second half, I might be having a baby, so I'm not going to feel maybe quite so good. There'll be some side effects.
Cool. Okay, yeah, so there's still people jumping onto this call, so admitting
it's all right, I'll do it, Kelsey.
Okay, fine. Cool. So I guess that's kind of the crux and the crannies of the menstrual cycle. I guess the only thing I want to highlight here, which we'll talk about a bit more later, is typically you'll see a big rise in basal body temperature in the second half of your cycle, and I'll talk about why that might be important from like a nutritional / hydration perspective later. If you're obviously warmer and you've got a higher core body temperature, you need to focus on things more like hydration and salt intake. So whilst this is obviously a typical 28-day cycle, we have to appreciate that everyone's different, everyone has slightly different cycles, and there's also maybe a whole population, let's say, of females that aren't incorporated into this, or two populations really. The population that's kind of on the screen on the bottom right, so that's an example of somebody who takes oral hormonal contraceptive. So this is a combined pill, and what you can kind of see hopefully from the difference is that pretty much all your hormones are flatlined. So you can see that the peak levels for both progesterone and estrogen are like 25, maybe go up to like 40, 50-ish. Whereas in a typical menstrual cycle, you can see some of them peaking over 250. So all your hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycle are flatlined. That can stop things like ovulation from occurring. Therefore, the egg can't be released, and therefore that stops you from getting pregnant. There's also other things to do with like the cervical mucus. So something actually being able to transport up the fallopian tube to meet the egg is another way that kind of contraceptives can work, but it just depends on the contraceptive type that you use. But for the majority of what we're talking about today, we are going to be typically focusing on this normal, I don't want to say normal because everyone's normal is different.
Uninterfered cycle, basically.
Cycle, yeah. A typical menstrual cycle, if you don't take any contraceptive use. So there's a few, I guess, red flags that we wanted to highlight and we felt is really important for you guys to almost look for or be aware of, because being obviously female and endurance athlete is quite common sometimes for these things to occur, and I think it's maybe not spoken about enough that some of these signs are a sign that something's not quite right potentially, and something that you need to be aware of and focused on. So whilst obviously the diagrams in front of us are focused on a 28 cycle, kind of the definition for a typical cycle is anything from 21 to 35 days. So if your cycle is above that number, you're maybe got a 40-day cycle, or below that number, that's a sign that something might not quite be right. You're looking to have more than 9 consecutive periods per year. So consistently, are they happening roughly within every 21 to 35 days? If these things aren't happening, for example, if you're not having a period, that is and you're not taking hormonal contraceptives and you're not potentially going into perimenopause or menopause, that's actually quite a big signal that you might be at risk of having low energy availability, so you're not consuming enough fuel for the work that you're doing, or you're at risk of something called relative energy deficiency syndrome, or RED-S. You might see it abbreviated too. This is particularly important because estrogen in particular is flatlined if someone has REDS, and estrogen is really important for bone health. So typically people that maybe are at risk of low energy availability or are showing symptoms of RED-S or may have RED-S are more susceptible to things like stress fractures, anything kind of any damage at the bone level, because of this low estrogen that's happening. And essentially, if you are not consuming enough or your expenditure is way off from your intake, your body then goes into kind of this preservation mode and it thinks, okay, what do I need to survive? Well, you don't actually need to reproduce to survive. So that's when you stop having a period and you might miss one, or it becomes more irregular. And then the last key one I wanted to point out was called an anovulatory cycle. So this is when you might actually still have a period, but you don't ovulate. This one's a little bit less obvious because most people don't know when they're ovulating unless they're obviously tracking through maybe like a natural cycles, which measures your temperature, or they're specifically using an ovulation kit, which usually people are using those to get pregnant, because ovulation is when you're most fertile. But it can be a sign as well that something's not quite right as well. So those are, I guess, the key main flags here, that if you have an inconsistent cycle, your cycles may be going from 20 days one month to 40 days another month, and there's quite a big variation. There's definitely worth having some further investigation into what might be going on in terms of like your reproductive health. Bex, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I can't remember whether it's on the next slide, Kelsey, before I talk about, but there is a question that's come in that says, does age, I think it was, does age matter, or does age play a part? I just wanted to touch on, and we won't go into this in detail today, but age definitely has an impact in this. So that's the graph I was after. So the graph on the bottom right that's showing now is basically someone that is entering perimenopause. So as you can see, to keep it simple, everything goes wild. You've got massive fluctuations up and down in estrogen and progesterone. It will have a huge impact on an athlete's life, whether that's their athletic performance or their personal life. It will impact everything. And when that starts, they may not notice. They'll know something's not right pretty quickly, but it might take a while to identify what's wrong. Because that can start anywhere from late 30s to mid 40s. Menopause average age is 50-ish, but that's the average age for menopause, and you can be in perimenopause for up to 10 years before then. So anything from 40 really, to quote a doctor that I actually saw a couple of weeks ago, where they're coming to you with some perimenopause symptoms, would be put down to that. So yes, age definitely is relevant. And then I think younger athletes who are just starting their periods, whilst the hormonal surges will be the same, I think the psychological and physical symptoms they feel can be much worse. So when you start your periods when you're younger, your cramps and your flow can be much heavier until you get used to it. So it would definitely potentially have more of a impact on younger athletes from even if it's just a psychological point of view and how they feel. So yeah, the answer to that question is definitely yes.
And on this next one, we just wanted to give you a bit of an appreciation for all of the things that kind of can be associated with this relative energy deficiency syndrome. You'll see differences in your mood, your irritability, and things like coordination and judgment. But you'll also stop seeing a response to the training that you're putting in. You'll obviously potentially see differences in menstrual function, and I've talked about the role of not fueling enough and having low estrogen and being at risk of stress fractures. But there's so many factors that it can affect from a health perspective and also from a performance perspective too. So we have reductions in the ability to store glycogen, which is one of our primary storage sites for energy when we're training and racing, and reductions in muscle strength. So whilst this is quite an oversimplified kind of representation, I feel like it shows kind of the physical effects that this can have and the side effects that reds can offer to someone if they do put themselves at risk of potentially underfueling.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that, you can't rely on your period to be an indicator of RED-S for some of the reasons we spoke about. If you're on contraception, a lot of the time you won't have a period, so that's not a good indication. Even if you're on the combined pill, you might have a period, but that's not a natural cycle, it's a withdrawal bleed, so that's not a good indication either. And from a coaching point of view, this is why feedback is really important on your sessions. So from a coaching point of view, we'll be looking out for, are you getting ill quite a lot? So that's the first red flag I would often, as personally as a coach, I will see is someone new coming into the sport. It tends to be someone new. And they will get reoccurring thickness. Every 6 weeks they'll get something, they'll be ill, and not purposely under fueling, they've just not realised they need to fuel for the increased sessions. So 9 times out of 10 you can nip it in the bud really quickly, but it does rely on that athlete coach feedback. And the other thing we're looking out for is, are you going through a training block and not having any increase in performance, or actually seeing a decrease in performance? That is another red flag. Stress fractures, as we've already spoke about, and just poor recovery in general if you're under fueling. But I'd say the biggest one from a coaching point of view, where I would see it quite early, is the reoccurring illness. That for me is normally the first red flag that I'll see.
Yeah. Bex, over to you for this one, I think.
Yeah, so from a athlete point of view, when we're looking at menstrual cycle, and the word I used with Kelsey is that she really liked, that she's not heard before, is we need to go after the low hanging fruit first, right? So understanding your menstrual cycle is fine, and it's really useful. Trying to sync your training to your menstrual cycle is probably like up in marginal gains type territory, because it is important to say that there are no specific studies really that suggest training with your cycle will give you performance gains. So there's nothing scientific to back up training, trying to do your training with your menstrual cycle. So you need to be going after the low hanging fruit first before you start to drill into the detail of this. So strength, consistency of your sessions, nutrition and sleep, that is the low hanging fruit as age group athletes. Those are the things that you need to nail to start with. If you're not healthy, then you're never going to be the best version of yourself. From a coaching point of view, what I would always ask athletes to do is to track their cycle. So if you're not already doing that, you need to do so. And I would encourage you all to put it in Training Peaks. And that's day one. So add a note to Training Peaks on day one of your menstrual cycle, and then pop a note in for the next 3 months predicted start date, and then just drag it around as you hit day one of your cycle. So that's the first point to know. And there's also some really good apps that you can use. So I use the Garmin app as well to track my cycle, and that does some really cool stuff in there. So track your cycle is point one. even if you are an athlete who is not having periods or you're having irregular periods, be really open and honest with your coach. It's really important that we know that level of detail, because if we don't know, we can't help. So if I have an athlete who has an irregular cycle, I do ask them to put it in training peaks, even though it is irregular. So when it happens, so that we can try and get it back on track, because as an athlete coming in for coaching, that is the first thing that we need to concentrate on establishing, and that's a regular cycle, because that is a good indication then that your body is in a nice, healthy, strong place to cope with the load of endurance training. So do always make sure you track your cycle. Impacts of periods are different for everybody. So athletes will come in and won't have any side effects and will happily get on with whatever training they get through whatever period of wherever they are in their cycle. Other athletes will then come in and they will feel absolutely rotten 5 days before the period is due. And the analogy I use with these types of athletes is kind of a bit like boiling a frog. So as an athlete, I will ask you to track your cycle, and then we will drop the intensity down about 5 days before your period's due. LT1 aerobic stuff only for those few days. That's to encourage consistency and just to get the athlete performing a training session when they are feeling a bit rotten. What athletes will tend to report in that time is a inability to push, and they will see their numbers drop, and what that does is it will often make them pack a session. So they'll start and go, I can't hit my numbers, and pack a session. So we get an athlete used to training in that cycle by just doing some LT1 aerobic stuff just to get used to the feeling, and then ever so slowly start to introduce more sessions that have closer to threshold in them. And the reason that we're looking to do that is because when you race, you are going to end up racing at any point in your cycle. And if you do not train and practice what you're doing, you're going to get to race day and you're going to have alarm bells going off all over the place. And that is not what we want. We want to go into a race with a plan, controlled, calm, and ready for any eventuality that may occur. And that includes being 3 days before your period or your period arriving on race day. So the reason that we boil the frog and we get the athlete used to slowly training at different points in their cycle, anything up to threshold, even in that period where they feel particularly rotten, is so that they can perform and execute a race well if they end up racing in that period. So in that time, you will then practice and think about, if you get your period on race day, what sanitary products are you going to use? There are lots of things out there and everyone is individual. The TCT Ladies Chat is a great place to ask questions. So the Moon Cup, for example, we've had a recent conversation on in there, gets really great reviews for using on race day. So, have conversations with your peers and see what works and what doesn't work for others, and try it in your training. A lot of people get a dodgy tummy. So you want to practice your fueling. What do you need to tweak to give you the best chance of not suffering with any gastro stress? Heat will play a big factor if you're going abroad and you're racing in the heat and you end up racing at the latter stage of your cycle. We know that your core body temperature is already higher and you're going to need more fluids. So you need to practice in training, taking on those more fluids and salt, so that it doesn't give you problems in overheating in racing. So it's really important that you practice and train so that when it comes to race day, we don't have a panic. And the thing that I would say is, when you are doing a session, when you're in training and it falls at a time where you don't feel particularly good and you do see your power or your speed drop off, you know what threshold feels like as an athlete once you're got some experience. And so threshold is just what threshold feels like today. And that might be 20 watts different to what it normally is. But guess what? On race day, if you're going to race at exact same time in your menstrual cycle, threshold is going to be 20 watts lower than it normally is. And that is just what we have to do to get through the race in a sensible manner. So don't beat yourself up about it and pack it and go, oh, I can't hit my numbers today and pack the session. We go, right, what does threshold feel like? And we perform the session to the best of our ability. We're keeping an eye on your heart rate. You're looking at what your heart rate's doing so that come race day, you can make those live adjustments. Anything to add, Kelsey, to that?
No, I just really want to highlight that if you don't already, in the first instance, before making any inferations, I don't know what the word is, or inferring that your menstrual cycle does have an effect, take advantage of, like, if you have a Garmin watch already, you can log your cycle on Garmin really easily. You can tell it when you come on your period, and then moving forward, it will predict for you when it's next due. It also will estimate roughly when ovulation is. So you get like a bit of a pink tab on the day, I believe, on the days that it thinks you're going to be bleeding or on your period. But then on Garmin, there's also a green tab where it thinks you're going to ovulate. So whilst you can't actually directly know you're definitely ovulating at that time, like you would, you're on your period because you're bleeding, you can still put into Training Peaks, this is roughly where ovulation is occurring, and take advantage of like the free platform that it is. There's lots of other platforms you can use. It's like Fit Our Woman, which has like educational like bits on it as well that tells you more about your menstrual cycle. You've got stuff like Natural Cycles, which you can take your temperature, so that gives you a good estimation of the day that you're actually ovulating on. But really just take it back a step and go, do I actually track my cycle effectively? Am I using an appropriate kind of platform, and am I communicating that with my coach before you even start thinking, oh, it's race day and oh, I've got my period? That might not be a bad thing for you. In fact, it might be a good thing for you. Like, until you track appropriately, you're never really going to know. So I think that's like the most important part before you start worrying about any of the other, I guess, contributing factors. And I'll talk a little bit about what the science says so far in a few slides. But yeah, I think that's the only thing I would add to that. It totally makes sense. And I think it makes sense that, and it's talked about by the coaches all the time, that getting a feel for what LT1 feels like, getting a feel for what threshold feels like is really important, because you do feel like you're somebody that the menstrual cycle is affecting your training. Then if you can feel what threshold feels like, then you're already kind of onto a winner in kind of optimizing the quality of the training that you can do when you are affected.
Yeah, I would just add to that as well. And just because you don't suffer with anything now doesn't mean that you won't suffer at some point in your life cycle. So, like, for example, I've never really suffered with any symptoms, kind of crack on, just don't have any impact at all. And then as soon as, I've hit late 30s, I've had some real side effects, and PMS, which I've never typically had before, that is actually quite, what I would say is quite bad, because I'm like, what is going on? I've never had this before. So it's important to track it and then realize that, your body will change throughout your 20s and then your 30s and then your 40s and then your 50s. So don't just track it for a short period of time. As an athlete, it's important to do it all of the time so that you can try and understand what's going on when things feel different or not right. Kelsey, there's a question coming actually, which is, what about athletes that don't menstruate at all or on the contraceptive injection? Which we have discussed a little bit before this presentation on contraception. And you're right, if you're on a injection or combined oral contraception, then you are having estrogen and progesterone popped into your body systemically, and therefore that isn't a natural cycle. So a lot of this stuff does not apply to you. I don't know whether you have a period, to be honest, on the injection. But if you did, it won't be a true period, it will be a withdrawal bleed. And so a lot of these symptoms and that we're talking about just don't apply. I'm not saying don't track that you cycle, but you need to understand that you are not having a natural cycle. So yeah, if you're not having periods, then the graph that we showed at the beginning won't apply to you. It'll be the flatlining of estrogen and progesterone that you've got.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult when you have contraceptives to then identify if there is potentially a problem. I've certainly worked with an athlete in the past where I suspected they were maybe at risk of REDS. They were getting ill all the time. They were getting injured a lot. They weren't adapting to training. And based on kind of other metrics that they'd given and spoken to me about, I did feel that they were potentially at risk. But unfortunately, she was on contraceptive. I think she might have been on the implant at the time. And because I felt so strongly about kind of getting this information, I did kind of say, look, I really do think you should have a break, which I know isn't possible for everyone. And obviously the main reason why you take hormonal contraceptives most of the time is to not get pregnant. So it seems counterintuitive to then tell you to come off it. But it's a really also important indicator of your health as well. So yeah, when you're taking contraceptive, it is kind of masking whether there might be something wrong, if you are potentially like chronically underfueling quite a big amount.
Yeah, and I think contraception is actually a really good topic, and I think we might do something separate on it because it is a big topic in itself. And there are contraceptives that might be better to use than others if you're an athlete. So for example, IUD coil is, in my opinion, a more preferable option than a combined oral contraception where you're not systemically putting stuff in. But it's probably quite a big topic to discuss. So we might do a separate session on that if there's enough appetite for it.
Yeah, I agree. We can do another talk on contraceptive use and all the different types, and I'm happy. I mean, I'm sure Bex is happy to share her experiences, and I can kind of share mine too. And I think, yes, we do need to kind of cover that as well. Bit of a long ball game. So going back to, I guess, the session today, and feel free to ask any questions, which even if they are hormonal contraceptive relevant, we can answer more of those at the end. But kind of going back to why it's important to utilize the menstrual cycle. Hopefully we've drilled in that it's an indicator of health. And I'm pretty sure most of the coaches or most people that work as coaches will advocate that to be the best athlete you can be, you need to be healthy first. You're not going to adapt to training and all the hours that you're potentially putting into work. We're all time constricted. We're all battling other commitments of family and work. So having the good foundations or the good low-hanging fruits, like Beck said earlier, making sure everything is correct, their menstrual cycle can be a good indicator for you of that. Obviously, again, Bex has highlighted that it can support the consistency of your training. So maybe if you are affected or you feel like you're affected by the menstrual cycle, is actually maybe altering maybe where that key session actually falls around kind of that time. Will that help make you more consistent in the long run? Enhance the quality. So we've already had a great example of actually sometimes it can just be psychological. I'm starting at maybe an LT1 to begin with and working on building that each month could be a way to kind of get around any quality issues around sessions or things that are maybe going to prevent you from going, nope, don't feel good, it's that time of the month, I'm not doing the session at all. And then last but not least, like Beck said, your race could fall. We book our races up to a year in advance, and whilst you can kind of estimate what might happen in a year's time, most people's menstrual cycle we're not robots, we're humans, and it doesn't fall on exact days, and therefore adjustments might occur by the time 6, 8, 9, 12 months down the line. So you have to be prepared for racing on whatever day that's whatever part of your cycle your race may fall on. So you kind of already talked about it from a coaching perspective, haven't you? I don't know if there's anything else that you kind of wanted to add when you think about menstrual cycle and performance.
I mean, to answer that question, there's a couple of things. I've got a question that I'll read out in a minute. Somebody's message direct.
Yeah.
To answer the question on the slide, does menstrual cycle affect performance? From a science point of view, there isn't much evidence to suggest one way or another. I think the important thing for everybody to take away would be it's very individual. Some people will have real big issues and some people won't have any at all. If just because you don't have any issues today doesn't mean that in 5 years' time that you might not notice issues. So that's probably the first point I would say. However, there are definitely psychological impacts, whether that's stomach cramps, gastro issues, you know, or just generally feeling a little bit rough, specifically in that high hormone phase that's on that graph there, and that does need to be accounted for. That's not necessarily with just doing easy stuff in that phase, and the reason I say that is for all the reasons I've spoke about. You're going to have to race in that period on race, you know, in a race. So we need to equip ourselves to be able to do that. And then the question that I've had, I'll read it out, is it normal to feel rough in the 3rd week instead of 5 weeks before? I do take combined pills, but I have been tracking my symptoms on Fit Woman for over 2 years and noticed that I do feel very tired, lack of motivation, sore muscles and not achieve the key numbers during the week. I took a break from the pills and my symptoms were worse. So if it is the combined pill that you're on, Kelsey, I don't know whether it's just worth flicking back to that graph at the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
Then you literally don't have that high hormone phase. So that doesn't happen at all. You really flatline those hormones. So from a pure physical point of view, then you probably shouldn't feel as many symptoms as you would if you were having a natural cycle, because you just don't get those spikes in hormones. But that's not to say if you're tracking your cycle, then you obviously you can see there is little spikes that go on, but there are a lot more frequently. You definitely wouldn't have been having a natural cycle. However, it makes total sense when you stop taking your combined pills that you found that your symptoms were worse, because what would have happened then is when you've come off, you haven't got that progesterone and estrogen going in systemically. You've got that natural cycle and you've got that high hormone phase that's in the top left-hand side of the graph of where you basically get your PMS symptoms. The PMS symptoms start just before day 0. So at the end of the graph, you get your PMS symptoms and then your period starts. And when you get your period, that is the closest point at which we are to a man's physiology, because our hormones drop. And we tend to, from a scientific point of view, be in the best physiological place to perform at our best. So physiologically, it is the best time to race when you get your period. So if you get your period race day, you need to be celebrating. But you want to make sure that you've listened to all the advice today and you've practiced it so the alarm bells aren't going off. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but there's a bit of background for it.
Yeah, and I think you have to be really careful in terms of like when you're coming off, you've got to remember that your body's going to take time to go back to normal and get into that rhythm. So you might find that after maybe 3 months, when you actually do find that your cycle's going back to normal, that those symptoms might then be reduced again. Not to say that will definitely happen, but I think you have to give things a bit of time and allow your body to settle into its normal cycle to really know whether the fluctuations are causing any of those symptoms as well. I'll briefly touch upon like a minute or so, because I'm conscious that we also want to get through questions as well, and it's already 45. I'll briefly touch upon what the kind of research has concluded in terms of the effects of menstrual cycle on performance, and then I'll talk about some of the nutritional considerations that you might need to or want to consider. And then I think that kind of wraps up the session in terms of what we wanted to achieve from today. So in terms of the research itself, it's very difficult to draw conclusions at this current moment because the research is inconsistent. People aren't in the research checking that people are actually in the correct phase of their menstrual cycle, so they're not taking blood samples and looking at estrogen and progesterone concentrations and not looking for this LH surge that happens before ovulation to know that they're definitely in the follicular phase or the luteal phase. And it's really difficult to do, very time consuming. It requires quite a lot of flexibility from the person that's being investigated as well. And as a result, as a general, the majority of studies that are done in this area are done with quite low quality, so it's quite difficult to draw some of these conclusions. But that being said, from what we do know, and there's a research group that have kind of pulled together all the data so far, when we look at the follicular phase, during the first half of that menstrual cycle, where you might experience bleeding, the science concludes that there might be a tiny negative effect of follicular phase. Again, depends on the individual, on performance. What I do want to kind of add in here is, like, in short, the kind of rapid changes in hormones may affect performance, but the effects are so small that things like sleeping properly, being consistent, getting the right nutrition might actually override some of those trivial effects. So the people that might gain an advantage, I guess, from knowing or racing on a specific phase of their menstrual cycle is probably someone that's looking for marginal gains, and that's somebody that's not an age grouper. But when we look at kind of the second half of the menstrual cycle, so this luteal phase, where we get a high hormone phase, so both estrogen and progesterone together are at their highest, that's where there's quite a high variability in terms of how females respond. Some females respond great. Some females feel great when they ovulate. Some females don't. Some females show signs of, and Bex has already touched upon this, PMS. So in those few days where the hormones are dropping again, they might feel that performance is being impaired, or they're struggling, or they're more tired, or for example. So it's really important that actually to think the follicular phase might not have a massive effect for most people so far from what the literature is saying, although the literature isn't that great. It's this second phase where the response to the cycle really varies between individuals. So looking at kind of this window between where you ovulate and before you start your period again might be like the most important part to kind of focus upon when thinking of whether your menstrual cycle in particular will affect your training and also your performance on race day. Becci, you want to add anything to there? I think we've probably covered everything.
Yeah, I mean, a good example would be, I don't know if anyone follows Laura Phillips. She's obviously a professional triathlete, and she does track a cycle, and some of the stuff she posts is really interesting. And she raced Kona. She was in the luteal phase of her cycle at Kona, and she, it's a recent post, said she knew that was going to happen. She knew that she needed to nail her hydration and also take on more salt, because she was already going to have a higher body temperature than she normally did. And that was all stuff that she considered going into Kona. So, I mean, that's a pro, right? But if I was going to do an Ironman and I was going to do it in a hot country and I had a natural cycle, I would definitely want to be considering the heat and my increased body temperature, and just making sure that I was comfortable, that I knew how my body might react. It's a good example.
Yeah. So just to kind of touch upon some nutritional considerations, and whilst I've kind of highlighted there might not be enough in terms of the research being there right now, there's some things that people can definitely think about and hopefully relate to as I kind of talk through maybe some experiences that you might have and what you maybe need to focus on. So my first question when anyone kind of comes and says, oh, I really don't feel great during this part of the cycle, I like to take a bit of a whole approach and go, okay, right, let's look at actually what you're fueling with first. Are you having enough protein so that you're recovering properly? Are you actually fueling for the work that's required? Are you making sure that these key sessions you're having a carbohydrate snack before, you're meeting kind of the carbohydrate recommendations for during, and then you're also having, yes, protein and carbs together for the kind of that recovery element? We've already touched upon how once we ovulate, there's this increase in body temperature. It's usually around like 0.3-ish degrees, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if you do experience it, you'll probably know about it. You'll feel that you probably sweat a bit more. You therefore might also lose a bit more salt. And that's definitely something to be conscious of from a hydration perspective. So making sure there's lots of sessions I know that have been done within, I guess, the total try where they've looked at sweat rate. It might be if you feel that you do sweat or you are definitely feeling the effects of being a bit warmer, that you maybe assess that before you ovulate and after you ovulate, and then you can kind of change your hydration requirements accordingly to when your race falls. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is kind of cravings, and people maybe mentioning how they might crave more sugar or sweet things at certain parts of the cycle. And whilst you might not necessarily always be able to fully get rid of those cravings, if that's something to do with your, I guess, your menstrual cycle, being prepared is the key thing. So have you got enough protein snacks available to grab that are going to stop you from maybe grabbing a packet of crisps or half a packet of biscuits or some other kind of processed food that might not be optimal for helping your performance? Sorry. So be prepared, have high protein snacks ready, make sure those sessions that you are going to hit, that are particularly the key ones, I know all sessions are important, but the key ones, you make sure you fuel those appropriately, and that might help with some of that. Also, another thing, and this is something I'm quite interested in finding out about, is a lot of the time when I've finished a race and I've spoken to females and about how they've been feeling, there's a lot of reports of like when you're on your period, you get like these additional stomach issues. And whilst nobody's kind of investigated that yet, there is kind of some suggestion. Oh yeah, I can give some examples of high protein snacks in a sec. There is kind of some suggestion that actually the menstrual cycle might give you a bit of a icky stomach. And if that is the case, how do you kind of overcome that? There's definitely things that we can do from a diet perspective, and something I've been experimenting with quite a lot with a lot of athletes, including myself actually. Making sure you've obviously practiced. So it's great if you can have 80-90 grams of carbs per hour during a race, but if the second your period comes, you can't eat that fuel, what do you actually need to do instead to try and make up the difference in those requirements? And there is a bit of talk of potential stomach, sorry, I'm reading the comments as they're coming in, potential supplements that might also support this, and this is something that we're kind of doing at the moment at Liverpool John Moores University. So I know Rob's doing a talk tomorrow on like training thresholds and training zones. As part of this study that we're currently doing, we'll do a threshold and a lactate assessment, and you'll get specific training zones within the lab for free. And if you feel like you are maybe somebody that's affected by the menstrual cycle, we're also looking at the effects of some of these gastrointestinal symptoms that you might feel like you experience when you're on your period versus when you're in this kind of high hormone phase, in the luteal phase. So if you are interested in finding out a bit more about yourself and your physiology and your response, to exercise in terms of menstrual cycle and GI symptoms, as well as some performance markers, drop me an email and we can send you some more info about that. But I think that is everything. We've got a few key concluding remarks there, but I feel like we've touched upon everything quite well. The only thing I'd say is, before you make kind of assumptions about your cycles, you probably need about 3 months of tracking to really look for those patterns and identify those patterns. Talk to your coach, work with your coach. They're there to help you. They might see something that you don't. I know it's quite easy to be in your little training bubble and focusing on hitting each session, but the feedback to them is also really important. Be prepared and make sure you're kind of fueling correctly. Do you have anything else, Bex, that you want to add before we kind of...
I wrote some note. I wrote conclusion: track your cycle, make sure you have a conversation with your coach. Training peak notes are really good to start with if you feel a bit awkward about talking about it. Just pop it in the notes. Phil Murphy is on, and he does coach me, and I am literally very open and honest with Phil. He has, and I'm in my 40s now, so I'm getting all sorts of weird symptoms. So he sees a lot of weird and wonderful notes, but it is that important to put it in, because we can help and work together better if you tell us. Observe patterns, note your symptoms, nail the low-hanging fruit, guys. Just get that right first. Avoid race day alarm bells and practice. So practice, no alarm bells. We don't want alarm bells on race day. Just to answer the question on the Marina coil that's coming, and you tend not to have a period when you have a Marina coil. That is localized progesterone, which is a good compromise because it's not going in systemically, and it's really good if you are approaching early 40s. I won't go into why on this call. However, it does make it really tricky to track your cycle, because you are going to have to go off any other symptoms that you get. So I've used that contraception measurement for years and years and years, had absolutely no clue where I was in my cycle. However, recently I've definitely started to have PMS type symptoms, so I can now track my cycle a little bit. But other than that, it's pretty difficult. I'm afraid there's no magic bullet for you to track that. And then Kelsey, maybe one for you. What sort of diet modifications, supplements would you look at with GI issues?
Yeah, I'm just going to stop recording. So if anyone does